Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. Today we have the distinguished Professor Warwick Powell from Australia joining us. So thank you. Welcome back, Warwick. Always good to have you.
Great to be with you.
So the reason I want to talk to you today is about there's a couple big items, China talking points on Western media lately. And one particular issue is the China's $1 trillion trade surplus. And this has got a whole bunch of articles written about how China is practicing predatory mercantilist policy. The West is a helpless victim. What is your take on that?
Well, certainly $1 trillion as a headline number provoked some pretty strong reactions from certain sections, I guess, of the Western political spectrum and also the commentariat. Unfortunately, the kind of reactions that we got were ultimately pretty shallow, lacked intellectual integrity, really, and ultimately, I think, are not self-serving but self-defeating. The surplus, of course, results from the fact that the world buys more from China than China has bought from the world, and there has been an appreciable growth in Chinese exports over the last 3 to 4 years relative to the long-run pattern of export growth in the previous 10. But in saying that, we need to break those numbers down a little bit, right? So, and I'll deal with that in two parts. One's obviously on the Chinese export part, and the other part I'll touch on is the import part, because that's where there's quite a lot of, shall we say, intellectual deceit going on, because nobody really ever wants to talk about China as an importer, other than to say that Chinese import growth rates are substantially slower in recent years than export growth rates. But on the export side of things, the principal exports that have grown in the last 4 years or thereabouts revolve around China's new technology areas in electric vehicles, in lithium-ion batteries, in wind turbines, and also in solar PVs. And of course, interestingly, in the last couple of years, in microprocessors, right? So Chinese microprocessors have been developing and, of course, now have an export market as well. These core technology areas have shot up in large part because China is a dominant player in these technology spaces. It has gotten manufacturing capabilities and efficiencies to a point where the costs of these things have dropped dramatically. In the case of EVs today from China, on a like-for-like, model-for-model kind of comparative basis to traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, you'd go with the EVs every day of the week now. They are so much more cost competitive. And in terms of the higher end models, in terms of features and add-ons, there is no doubt that the Chinese EVs today represent far better value for money. Unsurprisingly, as a result of that, they've been making inroads into not only the traditional markets for high-end motor vehicles like Western Europe. Of course, they're not accessible in the United States, so don't worry about that. But they are actually making incredible inroads in the developing world, in the global south. And that's because of their cost competitiveness. The second reason they're really attractive is because it contributes to, particularly the global south's ongoing electrification, which means that these countries are no longer as dependent upon imported petroleum as they once were. And this contributes in the long run to energy sovereignty, right? So if you think about these things that China's actually been exporting, they contribute to energy sovereignty for developing nations. The other things China, by the way, is actually exporting quite a lot of is machinery and equipment. And that, of course, contributes also to the economic development of the global south. So these are things that China has actually been leading the world in, and which drives this surge in exports post-pandemic, which is the period that has really gotten some Western commentators and some Western governments, seriously anxious and twisted up about. On the import side, the argument often runs that China is no longer importing from the world. Well, China imports about $400 billion worth of stuff. It's a very significant importer. And if you spoke to people in Australia, where I am, you would certainly view China as a very important trading partner, because Australia actually runs a trade surplus with China. So there are many things that China imports. And in fact, across all of the dominant categories that China imports, ranging from crude oil through to aluminium, steel, iron ore, iron ore, copper, gold, etc., aeroplanes, civilian aircraft, semiconductors, the volumes have actually been increasing. So volumes have been growing. Even if China's not paying as much for them, but that's a commodity price question, right? But volumes have been growing. So China is importing stuff, and importing a lot of stuff. And in fact, these two things are related, Carl. So many of Chinese exports are dependent upon a whole bunch of imports. On average, we have in China about 25% foreign value added, which means that for the things China manufactures, about 25% of the value, the export value, actually comes from the costs of imports themselves. That's on average. So there's actually a bunch of stuff where foreign input costs represent much higher proportions of total value. So in EVs, for example, some of the EVs will have foreign input costs comprising over 50%, which means that when the reaction that's emerged in the last sort of week or so to this $1 trillion surplus says China's RMB is undervalued and it needs to be appreciated substantially. The Financial Times talked about a 50% appreciation over 5 years. Others have thrown all sorts of numbers around, 10 to 30% undervaluation. Well, the message actually is, be very careful what you wish for, because in a world of complex global value chains, and China, of course, is central to all of these value chains. It's connected upstream and downstream. If you strengthen the RMB anymore, that will actually reduce the costs of many of these products, making them more competitive on the global market. And in fact, we've seen this pattern over the last 10 years where, as the RMB appreciated, and it's done so gradually, Chinese exports have not diminished. China's trade surplus has actually continued to accumulate. And that's a consequence of the fact that Chinese production systems are firstly very efficient, globally competitive, but also because a lot of the costs that go into these products that ultimately get manufactured and exported are actually costs incurred by importing things. So this $1 trillion is a trigger that should cause people to reflect a lot. But I think they're reflecting on the wrong thing. And I mean Westerners. They're reflecting on exchange rates. They're reflecting on this mercantilist stuff. Well, China's a big importer. What they really need to turn their minds to is the production problems that the West now has deeply embedded in their economic systems.
There's also some distortion in how the statistic is reported, right? For example, when the iPhone is being made in Chinese factories and exported to United States, that counts toward China's export. But whereas we now know, out of the actual value of an iPhone that those sold for over $1,000, only like maybe $10 is being retained. $10 of that profit, it goes to China. The lion's share of each iPhone sold goes to Apple. But that is not how the accounting is doing, because they're just looking at the import-export figures from the custom. They just see that the iPhone the entire volume of an iPhone as being exported from China. And also the fact that they discount the fact where companies like Apple, a lot of American companies, Apple makes tens of billions of dollars in China every year. But because the iPhone is produced in China, when they're sold to the Chinese customers, again, it doesn't enter into the custom import-export numbers. Right. So it's not counted in part of that balance of trade. And right now, U.S. is selling a lot of services to China. That again is not being properly counted for. You have American brands, KFC, McDonald's. KFC is on every street corners in China. Starbucks, right? A lot of these corporate profit is being taken out of China, go to U.S. But again, that is not counted toward the import-export figures. So I think there's a lot of distortion, but also there's a lot of copium in the Western press, because whenever they talk about competitiveness of Chinese company, they always spun it as somehow Chinese cheated, whether it's stealing intellectual properties or they through unfair state subsidies. Somehow the idea is Chinese government is flooding the market with trillions of dollars to support these Chinese industries that makes them undercut their Western counterparts, which is completely ridiculous, because it's not like the Chinese government have endless resources to subsidize the entire consumer base of the global population. And the other thing is like you already mentioned, it's because currency manipulation, because China is somehow artificially keeping the RMB low. That has been a talking point, I think, for the last 20-30 years. So I think, unfortunately, all these reporting is not helping their audience in the West to gain a true picture of what's emerging in China. But why do you actually? I might go on tangent a little bit. Forgive me. Why do you think that the Western media reporting are like that? I mean, they're not really serving their core audience. Their Western Anglo audience in terms of actually understanding China. Even if they're in competition with China, you gotta understand your competitors or what their true advantage is to have any kind of hope to deal with the problem. But right now, it just seems like they just produce a lot of copium.
Yeah, look, myths are actually very important in all societies, right? And in some respects, myths help people navigate their society and figure out where they fit into it and how. And myths not necessarily meaning falsehoods, but the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think one of the issues is that over the course of the last 7 or 8 decades in particular, there have been a whole series of mythologies that have been developed and which have become embedded in popular culture about the West's own understanding of itself and how it then views others. Its principal understanding of itself is that it is an exemplar of free market capitalism and liberal parliamentary democracy, all of which equals civilizational success. The idea that another place with a large number of people has not emulated that particular model or followed that particular recipe, that mythology, has also become incredibly successful, means that you've got to explain that success. And you either explain that by reference to the idea that perhaps other models are legitimate as well, but that undermines your first mythology, or you've got to delegitimize the other. And that's what they do. So the success of China is because it breaks the rules, is because it steals, is because of X, Y, and Z, or it's because of the benevolence of the West. So often you'll find in parts of the Western discourse that China's development and its success is because America allowed it to join the World Trade Organization, because the Americans invested in China to give rise to industrial development. So you've got these sorts of things going on, all of which, of course, seek to either promote a sense of self-aggrandizement or at least function as a kind of a self-esteem play. Now, none of that is particularly helpful in the long run. It's certainly helpful in the short run because I think everybody all over the world wants to at least feel good about, their society and their place to a certain point. But if you ultimately lose sense of perspective on your own mythologies, then you actually become totally detached from reality itself. And if reality and your mythologies become too far apart, eventually reality will have its revenge on you. Mythologies can become part and parcel of realities, but you just can't have them to be too far apart. And I think that where we've reached in Western discourse is a stage where the mythologies that have been part and parcel of this sense of civilizational self-esteem over the course of the last 80 years, and certainly during the last 30 years of Pax Americana, that is literally running out of steam. And China's success is actually the principal reason for that, because frankly, China shouldn't have been as successful as it has been if the Western stories were, sustainable. So I think that that's probably the main reason. It's a self-esteem proposition to start with, but it is incredibly unhelpful in the long run because it's also clear that many of the concerns that people in the West articulate about their own societies and their own economies, deindustrialization, unemployment, social fragmentation, reduced living standards, reduced literacy, numeracy, and all these sorts of things. All of these are real problems, but blaming someone else for those problems ultimately and paradoxically disables you from doing anything about them. You can only sit on the sidelines and complain, and yet many of these problems are fundamentally caused by structures and institutions that have long dominated the American political economy. Why is it that American capital over the course of the last 60 years progressively replaced labor with machines in the United States or shifted operations overseas? These are decisions being made by American capital. They weren't lured and, there wasn't anything nefarious going on. When American capital in the 1950s actually began relocating to other parts of the world, they actually first went to places like the Philippines for cheap labor, former American colony. And clothes were made there particularly and then sold back to North American consumers. So I think coming to grips with the fact that many of the causes of today's problems in North America and also in Western Europe are actually self-induced over a long period of time. That's a hard thing to do, but it's going to be a necessary thing to do if these societies are going to find ways of addressing the problems that they're now starting to genuinely recognize. Blaming others won't help. Talking about Chinese exchange rates actually won't help. In fact, if they actually got their way, which is a rapid and significant appreciation of RMB, it could actually make things substantially worse for them. I mean, imagine the cost of raw materials, intermediate goods, and capital equipment increasing by 30% for North America. Right? Imagine that. That's certainly not going to help American industrialization one bit. And so, you've got to be very careful what you wish for, and ultimately, building industry, as I think we've discussed before, it's not something that happens in 5 years. Industrial development, particularly to the levels that China has achieved, has taken 80 years, and it's taken 40 hard years in recent times, built on the foundations of the previous decade. So the problems that have emerged in North America and Western Europe over the course of the last 40 to 50 years are going to take a generation or more to address.
Well, I think might be a problem of people are always fighting the last war, right? When they're talking about currency reevaluation, how China must let RMB appreciate, they're probably thinking of United States past experience from its competitor like Japan. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Japan was looks like it was on the pace to surpass United States as #1 economy. And then U.S. imposed Plaza Accord on Japan, which included a very sharp appreciation of Japanese yen, which led to other issues like the Japanese asset bubble, and that led to the last decades of the Japanese economy, which Japan is still facing today. And I think I have a feeling it comes maybe it comes from the recognition. Oh, we done this before. We have dealt with economic competitor like Japan before, and we were able to address that issue. And now we just got to apply the same playbook against China. Do you think that's a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, look, there is a tendency to fight yesterday's wars, and without bringing yourself up to date with the contemporary situation. It's actually the easy thing to do, to treat today's challenges as analogues of some previous experience. But of course, the circumstances are entirely different. China is integrated into global value chains in far more complex ways than the Japanese were ever integrated. China's economy, of course, is substantially larger than Japan's was at the time. And China is simply a larger place. Importantly, of course, China doesn't have American bases on its territory, whereas Japan still does, which of course delivers an incredible amount of leverage to the United States when they're seeking to impose particular policy changes, which they successfully did in relation to Japan, but they'll have no chance of doing in relation to China. So the circumstances are fundamentally different. The United States, again, would be well advised, particularly the think tankers and various commentators and advisors, would be well advised to actually take a good hard look at reality, right? And if that means updating their prior assumptions about the state of the world, then they should do it, because it will actually provide the kind of clarity that you need from a diagnostics point of view that will then enable policymakers and communities at large to imagine new kinds of solutions to the problems at hand. Otherwise, you'll end up applying the wrong diagnostics, resulting in the wrong prognosis, and ultimately implementation of things that at best will have no effect, and at worst will actually make things worse, right? And it seems that at the moment, so much of the American body politic is responding with things that actually make problems worse. And if it didn't affect the rest of the world, I don't think anyone would care, right? But clearly, the American economy has and continues to be a big player in the global scene. Its military obviously is everywhere, and a destabilized and dysfunctional North America is actually not a great thing for the rest of the world. And so people do have, I think, legitimate reasons to hope and wish that America will get better clarity on the nature of its problems and challenges and have more sensible approaches to tackling them.
I think that's one of the biggest misunderstanding of a lot of the talking heads in the West, is that China and Russia, they actually do not want to destroy the United States. They do not want to destabilize the United States, because they recognize if that were to happen, you will create a huge chaos in the international system, and it's not good for economic stability for the globe. But in their zero-sum mentality, it's like that's the only thing they can see. And as you said, the more they become detached with reality, less energy is devoted to address the real structural problem that the Western economy face. But I see right now, unfortunately, it's totally going, United States in particular, but collective West as a whole as well, is really going in the opposite direction in the sense that as China continue to rise, the copium production continue to rise even more in the West. in the press, and that is really not helping them to address the real issues that cause them to lose the competitive edge versus China. Now that we are, I think we both agree on that part. But now, is there? Okay, I saw a economist reporting that they're arguing that because of China's trade practice or China's overcapacity, whatever, now we are returning back to a world where, actually, I think the title of the article was something like China is destroying the international trade in the sense that China is have nothing, China wants nothing from the rest of the world because it can make everything itself, and it's flooding the world market with the Chinese product. So this is obviously unbalanced and unsustainable, and it's going to destroy the global trade. And I saw people even make an analogy to the pre-Opium War economic relationship between China and Britain, when Chandon Imper famously said that we have no needs for your fancy little gadgets. We can make everything our own. How? I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, this is a piece that was in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago by Harding, and I think it was called something like "China's Making Trade Impossible." And it started with the analogy or with the story of Lord Macartney being told by the Chandon Emperor that China makes everything it needs and it has no need for foreign things. Now, one of the bizarre things about this piece is the analogy itself, because 50 years after Macartney reported on that particular encounter, the British responded with gunboat diplomacy in the Opium Wars. And I wonder sometimes whether, in fact, deep down, some of these Western talking heads, as you call them, kind of wish for or pine for something like that to happen again. And if that is something that they think is how the British should respond, then, of course, that's a very, very dangerous and irresponsible thing to be implying. The other thing about that particular article is the idea that somehow, again, that China is exporting the world to death. What it doesn't tell you is that Chinese net exports as a proportion of China's economy is less than 3%. In other words, China imports a lot of stuff as well, as I mentioned. And people who become obsessed with Chinese exports never really want to talk about China's imports. And if they do, they grudgingly make some remarks along the lines of, well, China's importing less and less, or the rate of import growth is much slower. It's flatlined. Well, in dollar terms, it has been a little bit flatter, but that's partly because of the rise of the value of the RMB, actually. So China's buying more and paying less. But in volume terms, if you actually measure things by tons and litres or barrels, or units such as civilian aircraft, Chinese imports have actually continued to rise. Probably the one thing where the rate of import growth has slowed down a bit in the last few years is, unsurprisingly, crude oil. And that's because of the growth of electrification in transportation in China, right? But aside from that, those other areas, whether it's iron ore, copper, aluminium, semiconductors. And in fact, here's the other interesting one. Semiconductor numbers have actually grown as well. And in fact, if there weren't export controls from the West on semiconductor exports to China and other high-tech equipment, China would have bought a lot more of them as well. So when you take all of these things into account, together with the 4 areas of exceptional growth in export terms from China, you take all of that into account, Chinese imports and exports are actually relatively balanced anyway in monetary terms. It's really not as big an issue as many of these people make it out to be. I get why it's a political issue. There are some optics involved, obviously, figures like $1 trillion. But the political issues actually go to the fact that the impacts are concentrated in a number of key sectors. And these are sectors that have material significance, certainly historically, but also today, but also have a sense of cultural significance too. And I'm particularly talking about vehicles, right? So the passenger motor vehicle industry has clearly been, for the past 100 years or so, a cultural symbol of industrial modernity. From the days when cars were first being made in the late 1800s, and eventually the emergence of mass manufacture in the 20s and 30s, the ability of a country to give birth to a passenger motor vehicle industry sector is really a sign of its industrial sophistication. And it occupies an important cultural role in that regard. And of course, it has been a very significant employer. So making motor vehicles traditionally, historically, has employed a lot of people. And they're concentrated. So not only are they concentrated in sectors, they're also concentrated geographically, which amplifies the political fallout when sectors experience downturns, because you end up with parts of the world that are visibly affected. So the United States, of course, has the automotive sector concentrated in Detroit. And we've seen what Detroit looks like as a result of transformations in the auto sector. Its population has shrunk dramatically over the last 25 years. So there are very visible signs of industrial competitive decay. So I think for cultural reasons, there are concerns. So I kind of get the political reaction, that emotional reaction, but that is not the foundations for a rational response. Because in the end, if your only way of responding to these challenges is to react angrily and carry on, then you're never really going to get a grip of why it is that this particular factory or this particular company is experiencing a reduction in sales, is experiencing an increase in costs or a reduction in relative competitiveness. For 15 years, the West has been well and truly pre-warned about China's ambitions in electric vehicles. In 2011, a well-known commentator, well-known today especially, who talks persistently about Chinese excessive investments and insufficient consumption and all of that. I won't name anybody, but it's the arguments that really matter. But this particular observer published a piece in 2011 which highlighted the investments that China was making in EV as an example of over-investment, of wasteful capital investment. 2011, right? By 2020, Chinese EV production started to ramp up and progressively impact the global market thereafter. During this entire period, Western companies, which began with a technology edge, began with established distribution networks, began with capital investments in the ground, were in the box seat to respond and actually lead the world in the transformation of passenger motor vehicles from ICEs into hybrids and ultimately into pure EVs. And they singularly failed to do that. That tells us something about the public policy frameworks that were operational in Germany, the UK, France, United States, Japan. You've got to remember, Toyota decided that batteries, EVs, was not the go, and they made massive commitments. They made a big bet on hydrogen, right? Hybrids and then hydrogen. Decided that EVs, per se, pure EVs, were not the way to go. So significant public policy failure, and also, of course, significant corporate failure. And now the chickens have come home to roost. The global market is shifting away from ICEs, in part because the EVs offer a lower cost, higher quality alternative, with the added benefit of enabling countries to become energy sovereign. Right? And becoming energy sovereign not only mitigates risks around access to energy, And we've seen some recent incidents where Americans have the American Navy has intersected oil tankers. So there are risks in the movement of the physical commodity itself, but traditionally you've also got to pay for that commodity with foreign exchange. And if you don't need to import so much oil, you actually reduce the burden that you have in terms of being able to access foreign exchange as well, particularly US dollars. So there's a double barrel benefit of shifting your transportation sector to hardcore electrification. All of this happened over the last 15 years. It wasn't like the Western governments and Western corporations weren't pre-warned. It was there for everyone to see. They just didn't act appropriately. This is part of the problem, right? And the lesson that needs to be learned from that, from the West's point of view, is be more mindful of what's happening, find pathways to collaborate where there are clear technology leaderships elsewhere in the world, and look for win-wins where you can. Right? That's the lesson to be learned.
That's interesting because, even as the narrative goes even into more bizarro world territory, there are pragmatic people in the West. There are pragmatic companies in the West that continue to deepen their engagement in China and continue to profit. Recently there's another article called "Germany is Seeking a Divorce from China," which is basically talk about how the German advanced China is moving into the traditional forte of German industry, which is advanced manufacturing, machine tools, etc. But German automakers actually are committed to invest even more in China, moving their R&Ds in China, and to deepen their collaboration with Chinese EV companies in China, because they do recognize that if they're going to make it, if they're going to be able to be competitive globally, they will have to be able to prove themselves in the Chinese market, because that is an area with a fierce competition. And there are also American companies like Apple and Tesla who are not, they're not decamping from China. So there are clearly people who are aware what's going on and actually, have been to China, worked with China in the past. And then there's this political talking class that's just, pulling things out of their butt and keep on selling those fantasies and comforting myth, as you put it, to the public. It's speaking of which, this of active misinformation in the Western media. I think there's a story you want to talk about, how the Western media misreported a recent article in the Chinese magazine, I think it was Qiusi, which reported quoted past Xi Jinping speeches, and then which allowed the Western journalists to cherry pick and then mistranslate and then misinterpret what Xi Jinping actually said, right? You want to expand on that?
Look, look, I'll add one last thing to your observations about some of those industries that are actively seeking to deepen their engagement in China, and that is in the area of chemical manufacturing. And there are German chemical manufacturers that are expanding their operations in China, in large part because they can access cheap Russian gas, which they're now unable to access in Germany. Just saying, I think, is how they put it. Look, there was in the last 48 hours or so, early this week, what was it? Probably around the 15th, 16th or thereabouts of December. The Chinese intellectual journal, the leading journal of the Communist Party of China, Qiushi, which incidentally means seeking truth, right? Seeking truth from fact. It published an article which pulled together some excerpts from 12 speeches and other texts from Xi Jinping on the question of demand and demand management, and boosting demand as a critical initiative. And this set of excerpts, and there are 12 of them, run from comments made in 2015 all the way through to comments made in 2025. The comments made in 2015, which of course appeared as the first little set of excerpts, number 1 of 12 in this article, talked about the idea that in the past, Chinese production capacity was below par. There wasn't enough of it, and through significant effort, it's been built up, and now there is excessive capacity. And so, as you know, there's been this narrative that's been run for quite some time that Chinese exports is because of weak domestic demand. Right? So that's the argument, and that weak domestic demand exists because households are financially repressed, they don't get paid enough, and that there's no social security system which forces households to save a lot, and therefore they don't spend. That's the story. And so the fact that this first excerpt mentions this idea of excessive production capacity was leapt on by a bunch of China watchers in the West as a bit of a ha-ha, there you go moment. But of course, when you read the whole lot, you realize that in fact the remarks that Xi Jinping made over the course of the last 10 years represents a subtle, complex and dialectical approach to this question of production and consumption and investment as part and parcel of this broad question of demand. So the title of the piece, of course, related to demand, Shuqiu, as opposed to consumption, right? So often people confuse these two things. So it was Shuqiu, not Xiaofei. And the reason why this matters is because in macroeconomics, demand actually comprises consumption and investment. So how are we to better understand this body of materials that was published? Well, basically, my view is that you've got to look at it holistically. You've got to treat the whole thing as a body of thought and understand how it fits together, not cherry pick the fact that he talked about excessive capacity in 2015. Because if we did that, we can actually then compare it to what happened after 2015 in any case and realize that 2015, China announced Made in China 2025, production actually increased, consumption increased. So this idea that Xi Jinping commented on excessive capacity back then as if that means something. Well, outside of context, it doesn't mean anything at all. It meant something because in part, this was off the back of massive government liquidity injections on the back of the global financial crisis. So remember in the first half of the 2010s, the Chinese government injected something like 400 trillion RMB into the system. Right? This really spurred the whole show on, and that remark in 2015 really was set in that context. So anyway, the whole point of this body of comments that were made is to actually say that supply and demand are intimately integrated with each other. And in fact, there are passages in this body that says supply and demand are inseparable from each other. You need supply to satisfy demand, and you need demand to spur on innovation and supply. And so the question of demand management is fundamentally driven by the idea of investment, particularly strategic investment in high-tech areas, which again is talked about explicitly in this body of excerpts. It talks also about the centrality of government investment, particularly when private investment is a little bit retarded or is not strategically oriented. And it also talks about the need to boost consumption through boosting wages, improving the social security situation. And there's actually another paper from the Peterson Institute of Economics, which actually explodes some traditional myths on that front as well. But basically, Xi Jinping's argument is that supply and demand are intimately integrated, and the real issue that needs to be understood is to achieve and sustain and work towards a dynamic balance, 动态平衡, dynamic balance, through an understanding of the need to promote the dual circulation concept. So this idea that demand and supply are part of a circulation system. And when you get Western commentators or, China watchers in the West leap on one part of this story, it again does great disservice to people around the world, particularly people who don't read Chinese and who rely upon these interpreters to shed light and provide context and interpretive understanding of Chinese public policy thinking. It does a great disservice to all of them when it distorts the fundamental framework that drives China's own way of understanding how to govern macroeconomic variables, supply and demand, and how it thinks about the role of government, markets, innovation, household incomes, and the interactions between investment and consumption. And unless you actually appreciate that through the lens of a Chinese perspective, you'll actually never really understand what on earth China's up to. And if your mission in life is to understand what China's up to, for whatever reasons, but you just want to understand it, and you want to shed light on it so that other people can understand what China's up to and can make sensible decisions around it, you're not helping anybody if you just want to cherry pick bits and pieces that somehow suit your particular narrative agenda. It's just another recent example of how Western tropes are a disservice to the West itself. It's unsurprising, of course, in this environment, how a whole bunch of people sort of start to think, oh, well, used to spend 20 years trying to bat back all of these misinterpretations and distortions. But in the end, what can you do? If it generates self-harm, it's unfortunate for the reasons that I discussed earlier, but people get tired of trying to help guide Western analysts through to a better understanding of Chinese public policy making, and particularly the ways in which Chinese leaders think about and frame the world that they are seeking to understand themselves and then to administer. So,
yeah, especially when they have to read the entire document to look for these specific passages that will conform to their own ideas about China. This is not misunderstanding. This is strategically missing the forest for the tree. And what Xi Jinping is talking about is actually he's talking about addressing an issue that face a lot of industrial societies today. And whereas they made this into a uniquely like a Chinese problem that finally Xi Jinping is admitting to. And I saw a comment, Arnaud Bertrand, who is a French entrepreneur who tweets extensively about China. She actually made a tweet about the exact article. And I was reading through the comments. And one person said, in China, the government treat governance as an engineering problem. In the West, the governance is treated as a messaging problem. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, look, China, with a combination of a long tradition of viewing the world in holistic terms, coupled with a Marxist tradition, which also views the world in system terms, actually has a way of thinking about the world which understands it as a dynamic process. So the idea is that the world is always in flux, things are always changing, and that in the economic sphere, the aim is you can't stop change. What you can do is guide change. Sometimes you can accelerate change. Sometimes you might want to slow down some change, because as change continues to happen and unfold itself through complex processes and feedback loops, you've also got to try to maintain some sense of dynamic pinghang, balance. And the reason why it's a dynamic balance is to try to get away from the idea that we are aiming to arrive at this static equilibrium state. It's dynamic because fundamentally the world is a process of change. So this is the Taoist traditions together with the Marxist traditions really shedding light on a way of thinking about the world. But if your framework is actually a neoclassical economics framework of supply-demand, where time actually doesn't really play a role, then you don't have a way of grasping change. What you have a way of grasping is simply this sense that, well, things are out of kilter, and therefore we've just got to push something to get it back into kilter. And this framework simply looks at distortions, right? The world naturally is equilibrating, so goes the argument. And when it's not equilibrated, we just need to find and remove the distortion. That's the framework that gets brought to this whole story from a whole bunch of mainstream trained China watchers, and they miss the mark. Whether they're right or wrong is in a sense a bit different, because what they firstly need to comprehend is how it is that Chinese policymakers actually frame the world themselves. There's no point sort of imposing your view on, the Chinese policy matrix if the Chinese policymakers themselves are actually framing the world in a different way. Right? If you want to understand policy making in China, you've got to do your best to think like the people who are actually doing the analysis, the people who are undertaking the diagnostics, the people who are evaluating the different prognoses available. There's no point simply imposing a Western neoclassical frame. It's meaningless. And unfortunately, I think you get a bunch of this. And the idea that somehow you can pick one word or one phrase from 10 years ago and try and elaborate an entire trope around it, look, at best, it's a little bit far-fetched. And yeah, look, if you read through the whole thing, look, I actually read it at about midnight my time, because I saw these messages pop up on social media threads, and with this haha, gotcha, told you so, finally admitted, blah blah blah. And I thought to myself, this seems a little unusual. So I found the link to the full story, which incidentally wasn't provided by the people who were posting this. Anyway, I found the link to the full story, and I read through it, and I thought, this is just so. It's sort of a willful deceit. It's sort of a self-deceit, because you're ignoring a whole bunch of stuff that you yourself should know if you bothered reading the whole thing. And there's no reason why the people who posted these things didn't read the whole thing. So they're cherry picking. And that's, well, it's deceitful to yourself, first and foremost, and it doesn't help anybody anyway. And I think in the end, it just exposes you to, the charge that you are missing actually the big picture, the real story, by focusing in on, one remark from 10 years ago that was decontextualized.
Speaking of Chinese governance and Western misreporting, I think there's a story you wanted to talk about, which is the sentencing of Hong Kong billionaire media tycoon Jimmy Lai. And this is often being talked about in the Western media as, oh, China is oppressing billionaires again, or, China is crushing Hong Kong's democracy. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief on it, but your viewers might not know, but I'm born in Hong Kong, so I continue to have an abiding interest in Hong Kong, and of course a soft spot for what happens in Hong Kong. And Jimmy Lai was sentenced earlier this week. The judgment came after some 156 days of evidence and argumentation. He was represented by a well-paid legal team and barristers, and the judgment ran into 800 pages or thereabouts. It was a damning indictment on Jimmy Lai insofar as the charges of sedition and colluding with foreign powers was concerned. The fact that he pleaded not guilty, I think, is how can I put this politely, is unfortunate, because there are so many published records of Jimmy Lai soliciting the direct intervention by the Americans in particular, but also the English from time to time, on Hong Kong matters and on Hong Kong people and on mainland Chinese people through calling for sanctions, etc. And ultimately also making two remarks which I think are particularly telling. One is this sense that he saw himself as a warrior in a war against the Communist Party of China and the People's Republic of China, and that he identified not only as a warrior, as a belligerent or as a participant in this war, but that he saw this as a war between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America, when he said that I'm fighting your war. This is your war, and I'm one of you. And the reason why I think that that's particularly telling is because it harks back to the way that the United States, in the years immediately after the founding of the People's Republic of China, framed the question of China itself, and the decisions made by the United States at that time to back and recognize the Republic, or continue to recognize the Republic of China, and to support Chiang Kai-shek. And many of your viewers will, who have a historical bent, and I know that, that's, well, they should, because you bring us a historical sensibility to everything that you do. When Senator McCarthy gave his very famous speech in 1951, when he attacked what he believed were communist sympathizers in the State Department, he described Chiang Kai-shek as our guy fighting our war. And then he went on to explain what he meant by that. And he meant by that a very explicit idea that Chiang Kai-shek was our Christian guy fighting the godless communists. It was our war. And Jimmy Lai invoked that sense that this was an American war against communist China. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, was his remark, which I think is quite incendiary, though some would say it was more of an allegory or an analogy rather than should be taken literally. But the idea that, America could smote China with the press of one big red button by dropping a nuclear bomb. Now, say what you will about it, interpret it how you want, but if the charge is one of sedition and collusion, then I don't think that there's any doubt at all that Jimmy Lai saw himself as, and he genuinely believed it. I don't doubt Jimmy Lai's sincerity in his beliefs, but that's the point. He was dead set sincere in his beliefs that he was a warrior for America, and he sought to enlist America's support in a war that he believed actually was America's war. So he's been found guilty. He will be sentenced in the new year. Whether or not he gets life sentence and whether or not he needs to serve terms concurrently or consecutively will be an interesting thing to watch. The fact that you've got a bunch of bloviators in the West carrying on about Free Jimmy Lai, particularly from the UK, makes me kind of laugh, because the idea that the British actually think that they have a right to comment on the internal affairs of another place simply because they colonized it for over 100 years is an insult. And the British really should focus a hell of a lot more on their own problems, because they've got a hell of a lot of problems. And to think that 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 they're still in a position to dispense judgment and opinion as if they're still the colonial lords in the Far East, is an indictment on the state of British politics and the exceptionalist conceit of the British elite.
Yeah, and also Jimmy Lai's second in command in his Apple Daily media empire is literally American from a CIA family. I mean, he said he has nothing to do with his father's, CIA dealings, but we'll have to take his word for it. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Professor Powell, for making your time to talk to us. It's always refreshing and eye-opening to hear you talk about matter related to China and economics, and look forward to have you back on my show in the not too far future. So thanks, Professor Powell.
Thanks, Carl. It's been great.
And for the audience tuning in, thank you for listening.